Senator Ron Wyden stepped onto the Senate floor and shattered the silence surrounding Jeffrey Epstein's shadow empire. In his hands was more than a speech, it was a warning. Inside the Treasury Department, locked in a cabinet and hidden from public view, sits a file that could unravel one of the darkest financial webs in modern history. That file documents 4,725 wire transfers worth nearly $1.1 billion. Let that sink in. One man, one account, and billions flowing across borders like a criminal superhighway. This isn't rumor or speculation, it's hard data collected by government investigators.
Investigation. Last year, the Biden administration allowed our investigators to look at portions of the file. We did that at the Treasury building. Here is what it says. Treasury's Epstein file details, Mr. President, 4,725 wire transfers. Let me repeat that. 4,725 wire transfers, adding up to nearly $1.1 billion flowing in and out of just one of Mr. Epstein's bank accounts. If you ask me, that is more than 4,000 potential lines of investigation right there. Hundreds of millions more flowed through other accounts. That's even a lot more to investigate. The file shows that Mr. Epstein used multiple Russian banks, which are now under sanctions, to process payments related to sex trafficking. A lot of the women and girls he targeted came from Russia, Belarus, Turkey, and elsewhere. One shudders to think about the kinds of people who must have been involved in trafficking these women and young girls out of those companies and into the Epstein web of abuse. Again, these are all potential leads, Mr. President, the Department of Justice ought to be digging into. This is about years and years of international sex trafficking. None of this is a hoax. None of it is a scam. And I'd like to say I consider it insulting to the intelligence of the American people for the Trump administration to simply say there is nothing to investigate here. Now, when the Trump administration came in with a lot of fanfare about transparency and openness, I said, I'm going to follow up on that. So I wrote to the Attorney General, Ms. Bondi, Treasury Secretary Bessent, FBI Director Patel, and I asked them all to produce the Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee so it could be reviewed. In fact, I've made that request multiple times. The Trump commitment to transparency, based on the response, didn't mean a whole lot because they just refused. Here's what one Treasury official wrote back to me. I'll quote here. The Department of Treasury has previously made documents available relating to the matter in response to your inquiries. Accordingly, we understand that you have the information you seek from the Treasury related to this request. We thank you for your attention to this important issue. Mr. President, for anybody who's familiar with how these discussions go in Washington, D.C., what I just read was code for the bureaucracy saying, you're asking for information, go pound sand. The Trump administration may be trying to close the books on the Epstein sex trafficking. But I want it understood as a senior member of the Senate Finance Committee, where we spend a lot of time looking at where substantial sums of money are going, particularly if they may be promoting wrongdoing and helping to evade taxes. We are going to stay on this fight to hold the wealthy individuals accountable for the harm that they clearly were involved in injuring the young women and others in this sex trafficking. So I'm going to have more follow-up for Attorney General Bondi very quickly. As for today, Mr. President, if she doesn't want to do the investigating, doesn't want the DOJ to do it, let me just restate my original demand. Have that Treasury information given to the Senate Finance Committee and have us on a bipartisan basis do our work. That's what we do in important investigations. If the Trump people believe they need additional authority to carry out the requests that I make again this afternoon, let me offer to help them write the bill myself. The idea that there is nothing more to investigate, not when you have 4,000 wire transfers, many of them associated with the possibility of wrongdoing and sex traffic promoting. The idea that you have that and there's nothing to investigate when it comes to the Epstein sex trafficking operation is ridiculous. Pam Bondi was the Attorney General in the state of Florida, where a lot of the Epstein crimes were committed. The Attorney General ought to know better, of all people. Mr. President, I can't begin to understand.
Transfers routed through sanctioned Russian banks, movements of money tied to trafficking routes from Russia, Belarus, and Turkey. Each line in that file is a breadcrumb leading to exploitation, power, and possibly the protection of elites who thought they'd never be exposed. But instead of transparency, there's silence. Instead of justice, there's delay. And while survivors wait for accountability, the most explosive evidence is kept locked away, gathering dust. Senator Wyden's message was clear: the truth is being buried, and if this file ever sees the light of day, it won't just expose Epstein, it could expose the system itself. At the center of Senator Wyden's revelation is a file the public has never been allowed to see. Buried deep inside the Treasury Department, locked in a cabinet and guarded by layers of bureaucracy, it holds what could be the most explosive evidence in the Epstein saga. Investigators were granted limited access last year, and what they uncovered was staggering: 4,725 wire transfers totaling nearly $1.1 billion, moving in and out of just one of Epstein's bank accounts. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 5,000 separate transactions, each one a potential lead into who was paying, who was benefiting, and how an international trafficking empire was being financed. And this is only from one account. Treasury documents suggest that hundreds of millions more flowed through other hidden channels, money that has never been fully explained. If those numbers were linked to any other suspected criminal network, law enforcement would be tearing it apart line by line. Instead, this file is sealed away, hidden from the public eye. What's inside could connect names, banks, and movements that the world has only guessed at. And the deeper you look, the darker it gets. The numbers inside the Treasury file don't just show movement, they tell a story. When investigators followed the trail, they discovered that Epstein's transfers weren't simple deposits and withdrawals. They flowed through some of the most suspicious financial channels in the world, including multiple Russian banks now under heavy U.S. sanctions. These institutions weren't chosen by accident. They were known gateways for moving money in ways that avoid detection, a financial shadowland where billions can disappear or reappear without leaving a clear name attached. What makes this even more disturbing is the scale. We're not looking at a few questionable payments. We're talking about billions moving across borders, routed through regions already flagged for corruption and organized crime. It looked less like the spending of one man and more like the financial infrastructure of a global operation. And while Epstein's public image was that of a wealthy financier living in luxury, the hidden financial picture suggests something entirely different: a system designed to fund, conceal, and expand trafficking networks across continents. These weren't random transfers. They were pipelines of power connecting Epstein's empire to institutions and individuals who still remain unnamed. Behind the billions of dollars and endless wire transfers lies something far more horrifying than financial crime: the destruction of human lives. The Treasury file reveals that many of the payments were tied to regions like Russia, Belarus, and Turkey. These weren't random locations, they were recruitment grounds, places where vulnerable women and girls could be targeted, exploited, and drawn into Epstein's web. Each transfer is more than a number. It may represent the trafficking of a person, the silencing of a victim, or the expansion of an operation designed to exploit the powerless. The chilling pattern that emerges suggests a pipeline of human suffering built on money, influence, and secrecy. Survivors have spoken about how Epstein's network used wealth as a weapon, creating a system where victims were treated as commodities, shuffled across borders like transactions on a ledger. The numbers in the file make it impossible to ignore. This wasn't just one man's crime, it was an international system, hiding behind bank codes and wire transfers. And yet, despite evidence pointing to organized trafficking across continents, the silence from institutions remains deafening. When Senator Wyden pressed for answers, he didn't expect the fight to be this difficult. Armed with verifiable evidence, he formally requested the Treasury and the Department of Justice to hand over the complete Epstein file to the Senate Finance Committee. On paper, that should have been routine, an oversight body demanding records tied to potential crimes. But instead of cooperation, he ran into a wall of silence. The official response he received wasn't transparency, it was dismissal. A carefully worded letter essentially told him that the Treasury had already provided enough information and that no further disclosures would be made. In Washington's coded language, Wyden translated it plainly: go pound sand. In other words, stop asking questions. This wasn't just one agency dragging its feet, it was an entire network of institutions, agencies with the power to investigate, prosecute, and expose, choosing to look the other way. By refusing to act, they weren't just ignoring evidence, they were actively protecting a system of secrecy. For survivors waiting on justice, every day of delay feels like betrayal. And for the American public, it raises a haunting question: if billions tied to trafficking can be buried, what else is being hidden? One of the most striking parts of this story is who had the power to act and chose not to. Pam Bondi, once the Attorney General of Florida, oversaw the very state where many of Epstein's earliest and most disturbing crimes took place. If anyone understood the depth of his offenses, it was her. She had both the legal authority and the moral obligation to ensure justice was pursued. Yet when confronted with the chance to dig deeper into the financial files, she refused. Instead of championing the survivors, Bondi's office repeatedly deflected. Her role, both past and present, has been marked by a troubling silence at the moments when action mattered most. Critics argue that her inaction wasn't simply negligence, it may have been protection. Protection of institutions, of names, and of connections too powerful to expose. The optics are impossible to ignore. A top official, fully aware of Epstein's crimes in Florida, later positioned at the national level, yet unwilling to open the very file that could unravel the truth. For survivors, this silence feels like abandonment. For the public, it feels like confirmation that when the powerful are implicated, accountability suddenly becomes optional. The Epstein file isn't just about one man's crimes, it's about the machinery that allowed those crimes to thrive. What Senator Wyden uncovered points to something far more disturbing than personal corruption. It points to a system where money and influence buy silence, where institutions built to protect the public instead shield the powerful. Billions of dollars don't move unnoticed. International transfers through sanctioned banks aren't accidents. Yet the response from agencies that should be leading investigations has been hesitation, delay, and secrecy. This looks less like incompetence and more like deliberate protection. Protection not of victims but of individuals and networks who might be implicated if the full truth ever came to light. This is why the Epstein case continues to resonate. It exposes a fundamental question: does justice in America apply equally to everyone, or does it stop at the doorstep of the rich and connected? Survivors are left in limbo, while citizens are left wondering how much of the system has been compromised. What Wyden is pushing for isn't just answers about Epstein, it's about breaking through a wall of power designed to keep the truth buried, no matter the cost. Senator Wyden has made it clear that silence is not an option. He isn't asking for summaries, filtered reports, or carefully redacted pages. He's demanding the full release of the Treasury's Epstein file. Every transfer, every account, every unexplained movement of money must be laid bare for Congress and the American people to see. Anything less is just another cover-up. This isn't about politics, it's about financial oversight, accountability and justice. Wyden sits on the Senate Finance Committee, a body tasked with following the flow of money in cases where corruption or wrongdoing may be hiding. And in this case, the numbers themselves scream for investigation. Nearly 5,000 transactions, crossing borders and flowing through suspect banks, can't be brushed aside as routine business. Wyden's message is straightforward: when you follow the money, you follow the truth. And the truth doesn't stop with Epstein. It could reveal accomplices, protectors, and an entire network that believed it was untouchable. The question now is whether the institutions holding these secrets will release them, or whether it will take relentless pressure from the public to force transparency. Because without exposure, justice remains out of reach. At the heart of this story is a choice between transparency and secrecy, between protecting survivors or protecting power. The Epstein file represents more than financial records. It is a roadmap of connections, transactions, and possible collaborators who enabled one of the darkest operations of our time. And yet it sits locked away, hidden from the very people who deserve answers. Senator Wyden's fight isn't just about one man. It's about whether a system built on accountability will finally live up to its promise. If nearly $1.1 billion in suspicious transfers can be ignored, what hope is there for ordinary people seeking justice against those with limitless wealth and influence? The silence of institutions sends a dangerous message that some crimes are too inconvenient to expose, and some people too connected to be held accountable. But silence can't erase the truth. Every transaction is still there, every number still waiting to be uncovered. The only question is whether enough pressure will be applied to finally force the release of the full file, because when the truth comes out, and it will, the world will see that this was never just about Epstein, it was about power itself.